All right, welcome to part two of the carbohydrates discussion. We're going to pick up where we left off. We finished talking about resistant starches, so we really used the first half of this lecture to sort of set the stage. We did touch on a whole bunch of different topics, but really we got into all the different types of carbohydrates, what their functions are, where they're coming from, that kind of good stuff. We're going to pick it up here with sugar. We could easily spend the whole semester talking about sugar, the research on sugar and its effect on our health and our body weight um, and beyond have really picked up the last probably 5 to 10 years. And a lot of scientists, doctors, researchers, are comparing sugar to things like cigarettes and calling it a poison and calling it a toxin. Added sugar to our foods is something we should really strive to avoid to consume an optimal diet. And I'm not going to get into all those details in this class. I think Sean does a decent job in the dark side of touching upon why we shouldn't consume sugar. Avoiding sugar is ridiculously hard in our current food supply. It's you look at the ingredients list of foods where you think no way in the world should hot sauce have sugar in it. This is a hot food. Why would you put sugar in hot sauce? Guess what? There's sugar in most hot sauces, right? Things like tomato sauce. I don't want to pick on just tomato products, but we find sugar in everything. And again, sugar is a natural part of a lot of foods. Fruits are full of it, right? And but it's when we start getting into these incredibly high levels of sugar that it can really mess with our health. So this is really just my one slide statement on, yeah, we should avoid it. It doesn't do us any good nutritionally. There is a time where sugar can be okay, and that's when we're training. It does help, and we can talk about nutrient timing, which we'll get to at the end of this talk. Yeah, okay. There are times where sugar can help us when it comes to exercise performance, but other than that, avoid it. So some of the things, right, that sugar can do, it can crowd out other nutrients. And one thing about the nature of the sugar molecule, we're talking the sucrose, the disaccharides and monosaccharides, they're very competitive in comparison to other molecules to get, or other nutrients to get into cells. And so as an example, I've read a little bit about how consuming a lot of sugar, the high amounts of glucose will enter the cell preferably over things like vitamin C. And so somebody who's consuming a lot of vitamin C thinking they're doing a good job for their body, as an antioxidant, keeps them healthy. If that's in conjunction with a high sugar diet, the vitamin C never gets to where it needs to go, and you basically just pee it out. So sugar is very competitive in that way, and it crowds out other more beneficial nutrients, namely especially some vitamins. Over consuming sugar over a lifetime, right? Sugar meals, high sugar meals, sugar rushes, we get this massive spike in our blood sugar, right? And you know the digestive process right now, right? You know that if something makes it into our small intestine, that's incredibly simple as a carbohydrate. Let's just say you have that big gulp of soda. There's no digestion that needs to happen. It's all disaccharides in that. It's basically one enzyme reaction, boom, glucose makes it into the bloodstream, and you have this incredibly huge spike in sugar. That puts a massive amount of stress on our body to deal with that sugar in our blood. And that opens up the conversation into the role of a hormone called insulin, which is coming up next. But insulin is that hormone responsible for getting sugar out of our blood and into our cells. Over time, these massive rushes of blood sugar calling upon massive rushes of insulin to get that sugar into our cells, the receptors for insulin can and do start to fail over time. And so we become what's called insulin resistant, meaning that for a certain amount of insulin released into our blood sugar, glucose in the blood, doesn't go down as quickly as it should. It doesn't enter the cell as it should. Over time, insulin resistance can lead to something called diabetes, and diabetes is one of the top 5 killers of Americans and across the world. It's a pretty big epidemic in terms of the health consequences with what is essentially diabetes or uncontrolled blood sugar. So thank you, sugar. Fatty liver is a consequence of overconsumption of carbohydrates. Not for everybody, but in some people, that conversion of carbohydrates to fat in the liver, the fat doesn't always get excreted from the liver. And so over time, the liver, poor liver, right? Beating the crud out of it, that fat starts to deposit within the liver and stay in the liver. And fatty liver is not a consequence of over consuming fat, not even close. Fatty liver is a consequence of eating too much sugar. And so, yeah, that's a big deal. Heart disease, in terms of the effect of sugar on our on the amount of triglycerides in our blood, also getting back to the liver. The release of the very low density lipoproteins as a byproduct of the conversion of sugar to fat in the liver. These are increasing markers for cardiovascular disease, not because we're eating too much fat, because we're eating too much sugar. Too much sugar can suppress the immune system, a little bit in line with that relationship between it crowding out other nutrients trying to get into the cells. But also, when we consume a lot of sugar, we're not consuming other foods, right? Sugar is pretty calorically dense, high energy foods. And if you eat a lot of sugar, you're not eating a lot of the other good stuff. And then lastly, sugar is, because it gets into cells so quickly and so rapidly and can kind of be a problem in that way, it's considered an inflammatory product, which means it causes inflammation in the various areas where it's being utilized and absorbed in our body. Inflammation is quite often the root cause of other conditions that may spawn from it. And people argue, yeah, heart disease is a byproduct of inflammation. Diabetes is a byproduct of inflammation. Reducing inflammation is a key into increasing quality of life and health. So consuming too much sugar can affect that. That's it on sugar. So I just mentioned the relationship between sugar, carbohydrate consumption, and blood glucose. And so this graphic, and you've probably seen this in other classes, I hope you have, or something similar. And so in the middle of this graphic, we have kind of this narrow range of normal blood glucose, right? For most people, between 70, 110 is considered normal. And your blood sugar will be going up and down throughout the day, and your body likes it to be in that narrow range, right? If it gets too high, that's too much sugar, and that can cause consequences. Certain cells don't do well with a lot of sugar in the blood, a lot of glucose in the blood. So the body acts quickly to bring it down to normal levels. Just like if you have, high blood pressure or high temperature or other things that, your body likes to be in homeostasis. Homeostasis for blood sugar, 70 to 110-ish. So when we consume meals high in carbohydrate, especially simple carbohydrates, we will get out of that happy range of 70 to 110 or 70 to 109. And we have what's called high blood sugar, right? Glucose goes up. Okay, well, how does the body deal with it? Well, we have this wonderful hormone called insulin. So the pancreas releases insulin, and I'm up on the top part of this slide right now. So everything's happy. We eat our favorite high sugar meal. Blood sugar will go up after we consume that meal. So we have elevated blood glucose. Pancreas will release insulin. Insulin will do its job, which means it'll get glucose into the cells with the glucose transporters. GLUT4, GLUT5 transporters are these transporters that come to the cell membrane, grab the glucose and bring it into the cell. Yay. And then glucose, once it makes it into the cell, depending on the circumstances of that individual, the glucose is either used for energy, converted to glycogen, or converted to fat. Kind of its three fates. And once that process is complete, we got this nice big blue arrow bringing us back to normal blood glucose. Well, one thing that happens is that when blood sugar levels go high and insulin gets released, insulin gets released in proportion to how high blood sugar goes. The height or the peak of blood sugar is referred to as a glycemic index response, and that's directly related to how much and the type of carbohydrate is in the food that you ate. And so the simpler carbohydrates will, for obvious reasons, have a higher or cause a higher spike in blood sugar compared to foods that are lower or more complex in carbohydrates. So when insulin gets released, it gets released in proportion to that spike in blood sugar. The problem with insulin is that it doesn't just go away when blood sugar comes back down to normal. So insulin does its thing, blood sugar is back at normal, but guess what? If there's still insulin in the blood, which very well may be the case, blood sugar, like in this graphic, may continue to go down as glucose enters cells, and then we end up having a hypoglycemic or low blood sugar episode. When blood sugar is low, then the pancreas releases a different hormone. It's called glucagon. Glucagon will then liberate stored glucose to bring blood sugar levels back up. So it taps into the liver, taps into the muscles to release glucose from glycogen in those tissues. If we're void of glycogen being stored, we will tap into proteins, and the proteins will make new sugar through the process of gluconeogenesis, and blood sugar will return back to normal. So that's the process. We want things to stay in that happy range. we don't want to have high blood sugar. We don't want to have low blood sugar. We don't want to mess with the body. And again, over time, we talked about diabetes on the previous slide. Over time, too much of this over the years of, big gulps and cake and ice cream and other sugar-packed foods that we probably shouldn't be touching, and cereals and so much, right? That's going to lead to this happening all the time and potentially that onset of diabetes. So we have some tools in the nutrition world, and they're used outside of the nutrition world as well. The glycemic index and the glycemic load. The glycemic index is a measure of how quickly a portion of carbohydrate raises a person's blood sugar compared to a control. And the control of that the glycemic index uses is white bread or pure glucose. So if you had a serving of white bread or pure glucose, your blood sugar would raise to a certain level. That's our 100 level. You're wondering, wow, does white bread really have the same effect on our blood sugar as glucose? Yes, it does. That's how evil white bread is, right? And so the glycemic index is a useful tool because really we don't want to necessarily have these spikes in blood sugar. So consuming foods low on the glycemic index sounds like a reasonable idea. There are diets out there, low glycemic index diets. They're fantastic. In my face-to-face nutrition classes, I think I've already mentioned, we do a diet project during the semester, 30 days on a diet by each member of each group in the class. And a lot of groups will do the low glycemic index diet, which ends up being a lot of just natural vegetable, raw vegetables and cooked vegetables too. Good proteins, just a good mixed diet with just no added sugar. It's quite nice. So the glycemic index is useful in terms of people with diabetes as well. And you'd imagine someone with diabetes who has problems controlling blood sugar probably would want to avoid consuming foods high on the glycemic index scale, and that's the case. The glycemic load, do I have it on here? Yeah. So we'll talk about the glycemic load next. On the bottom of this slide, and kind of snuck in here, probably not the best way, I should flip it with the glycemic load, but there's also something called the insulin food factor. And in 3 or 4 lectures, we're going to start talking about weight management, fat management. And we're going to get into insulin and its role in us storing extra body fat. And so a lot of people point to insulin as being this culprit of, oh yeah, too much insulin in the body. Insulin helps things get into cells, not only carbohydrates, but also fat into cells. And so if there's too much insulin in our blood, we're going to gain fat and all this stuff. So there's this insulin food factor out there. That's a pretty cool tool to better understand how a particular food affects insulin levels. It's not too different than the glycemic index, except for, because you'd think, okay, foods high on the glycemic index are going to have a high insulin food factor, and that's usually the case. What's interesting about the IFF, the insulin food factor, is that there are certain foods, for example, like a piece of steak, that actually has quite a high insulin release as a result of that food. Now, there's no carbohydrates going around, and there's not so many issues with insulin resistance with that, but there's some interesting research going on this insulin food factor. Most of it's being done in Sydney, or it started at the University of Sydney. I'm sure it's grown since then, on how different foods, non-carbohydrate foods, are affecting insulin release. The one other tool that we have associated with the glycemic response to foods we eat is called the glycemic load. And so the glycemic index is more of, okay, how quickly does that spike go up, and probably how high does the spike go up is the glycemic index. The glycemic load is more how much carbohydrate is being placed on our body. How much of a load are we dealing with here? And so the glycemic load needs to be calculated. So the glycemic load is the glycemic index divided by 100 and then multiplied by the available carbohydrate content in that food. So that would be carbohydrates minus fiber. So there are foods like the watermelon that I have down here that has a high glycemic index. The watermelon has a lot of sugar in it, naturally. And so the spike in blood sugar from watermelon goes up quickly and gets pretty high, but it drops really fast because there's not much sugar in watermelon. So the glycemic index of watermelon is 80. 80 is high. I have a chart on the next slide. But the glycemic load of watermelon is actually quite low. So the glycemic load is a nice tool to know how much carbohydrates are you sort of putting into your body in terms of its relationship to the blood sugar response. So looking at the glycemic index and load, the range for glycemic index, 70 and above is considered high, medium 56 to 69, and then low glycemic index food 55 and under, right? And so I mentioned that low glycemic diet, you just eat only foods that have a glycemic index of 55 and under. So generally speaking, yes, we already mentioned this, high glycemic index and glycemic loads will cause greater insulin release. That will often cause that drop in blood sugar. And getting back to our digestion talk, right? If we have a drop in blood sugar, what's that going to lead to? Hunger, right? And so all of a sudden, hopefully the wheels are turning going, oh, wow. So when I eat foods high in carbohydrates, even if they have a lot of calories in them, which they usually do, I get this wonderful spike in blood sugar. We usually feel pretty good, right? We get that sugar rush. But then that resulting drop in blood sugar because of that over release of insulin is going to make us hungry again. And so one of the evil things, right, if I use that term I called carbohydrates the enemy, right? So one of the things that makes carbohydrates the enemy is that, yeah, we get these spikes in blood sugar, not good, potentially leads to insulin resistance and diabetes. And then following that spike in blood sugar, we have a drop in blood sugar, which makes us hungry and more likely to eat more food when we actually don't need more food. And so that's one of the issues, and it's very biochemical in nature, that why, overeating carbs can possibly be worse than overeating fat. Overeating fat doesn't cause changes in blood sugar that affect hunger and all those other things. So, so the middle bullet here, overconsumption of high GI and GL foods does increase our risk for diabetes, does increase LDL and triglyceride levels. We've kind of talked about that already. There's some drawbacks in calculating the numbers for this. So for your second dietary analysis, I have you check the glycemic index and glycemic load of your diet. I think it's important for you to do as a nutrition student. I just think it is. So that's part of your second dietary analysis. It's coming up in a while. And so be mindful that the glycemic index and load are best for individual foods, not prepared foods, not foods coming from a recipe necessarily. And so the way they calculate glycemic index is they take in a group of individuals, much like yourselves, and they go, all right, you've all been fasting for a while. We're going to give you an egg. Maybe not the best example. Eat the egg and we're going to measure your blood sugar in 45 minutes. And based on how high it is, we'll take the average of the class compared to what it was following the dose of glucose or the white bread, and we'll come up with a glycemic index for that. And they go, okay, and then now that we've done that, we're going to do it on an apple. So the values in these two indices, are really good for just straight foods, eggs, apples, carrots, bananas, whatever it is. But as soon as we start to mix foods, which is kind of what we do, right? You put a bean and rice and cheese burrito in there with some guacamole and salsa. What's the glycemic index of that? Well, we know the glycemic index of maybe all the individual foods, the tortilla, the beans, the rice, the cheese. But when we mix them, it'll affect how quickly the sugar from those foods, the carbohydrates from those foods, enter our blood. And so the drawbacks in calculating the numbers or estimating these numbers for the glycemic index and load start to become less accurate the more mixed our meals are, right? And so we have to be mindful of that. But it is reasonable to assume if you're eating a meal that has, has a Coke, a baked potato, and some Fruit Loops, all very high glycemic index foods, it's going to be a high glycemic index meal. It's also fair to assume that if you're mixing low glycemic index food, it's going to be a low meal. When we start to mix the high and the low, things get a little bit wonky. So just be mindful of that. Here's the glycemic index of some common foods, and make note, these are all just pretty much individual food products, right? Yeah, rice bran. Who eats rice bran? Not many people anymore. But we just have individual foods: corn, sweet, wild rice, sweet potatoes, white rice. You'll notice that the grains and starches go all the way from a pretty low value, 27. Again, rice bran is more of a condiment than it is an actual food. But, and then we get all the way up to some of the higher end things: baked potatoes, like I said, quite high. Cooked oatmeal, this is not overnight oats. Taco shells, white bread, white bagel, all on the very top of the scale. Vegetables, fruits, dairy products, proteins, they're all on there. There's different lists, and I explain it in your assignment where to find different glycemic index lists. So, but at least here's some examples of the glycemic index of various foods. All right, so let's talk. We're going to finish this lecture, but we still have a handful of slides to cover, so don't get too excited. But we're going to talk about the role of carbohydrates in exercise, right? So this is where we're going to start talking about sort of this relationship between what we eat and how we perform. And so the first question, what should an athlete eat in the days leading up to competition? Well, if we're looking just at carbohydrates and we're looking at some sort of competitive event, whether we have a soccer tournament, a marathon, big game on the weekend, whatever it is, leading up, we should just continue eating a well-balanced diet, whatever we determine that well-balanced diet is. Maybe you are on a 60% carbohydrate diet. We'll just keep eating that. There is something called carbohydrate loading. And so carbohydrate loading is often referred to as supercompensation or a supercompensation diet. And so because we recognize as sport nutritionists, right, that our body doesn't store much carbohydrate, is there a way to help it store more? The answer is yes, and that's the supercompensation or carb loading strategy. It's a strategy to force the body, encourage the body, I guess, to store more carbohydrates than normal. Most average size individuals can store about 500 grams of carbs in their body, and that's very average numbers. Different body sizes, different muscle mass and all that will change that, but just think about 500 grams of carbs. During events lasting usually 2 hours or more, the loss of or lack of carbohydrates in the body will cause fatigue to some level. And so the idea is, if I can turn my body's storage of carbohydrates from 500 grams to 600, it'll take longer for me to reach that level of fatigue associated with carbohydrate depletion. And so that's where these types of strategies have come into play. The carb loading is definitely not for all sports and events. If you're doing a sporting event that lasts less than, I would say, an hour and a half, 2 hours, totally not worth it. Who benefits the most? Those who are doing events longer than 2 hours. Those doing events whose change in body weight may not affect their performance. One of the drawbacks of the carb loading is that with the extra carbohydrates in your body, you're going to be holding on to extra body water. And I think the ratio is for every extra gram of carbohydrates, you're going to store an extra 3 grams of water, I believe. And so, you're looking at an extra pound, maybe a couple of extra pounds or two, right, of water weight to come in with those carbohydrates. And so that are being stored in your muscle. All of a sudden, you went from a 150-pound athlete to 152, 153. Is that going to affect your performance? Maybe, maybe not. The strategy, I've really simplified it here. You got to Google different strategies because there's multiple ways to do it. Generally speaking, this 3-step strategy is a way that people do it. So, taper a week before whatever event you have going on, which means you decrease your training volume but keep your training intensity similar to what it normally is. In that final week, eat a typical diet during the first 3 days. So let's say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, normal diet. But then once you get to Thursday, really start to crank up the carbohydrate consumption. So Thursday and Friday, you're just a carbaholic, right? So you're really dropping fats out of the diet for the most part, keep your proteins where they always are, and you sort of drop the fat, you're going to 80% carb diet. And then by Saturday, you're going to be super carb animal, right? There's different strategies. Originally, they would have people use this and deprive themselves of carbohydrates for 3 or 4 days. So let's say the Saturday, like a week before an event, let's say Saturday, Sunday, Monday, maybe even Tuesday, very low carbohydrate diet, keep training. That low carbohydrate diet, that carbohydrate depletion really turns the body into a carbohydrate sponge. And then they do that overloading of carbs the day coming up to the event. It works really well in having us hold on to extra carbohydrates. So instead of 500 grams, maybe 600, 700. But that decreased performance during training during those carb depleted days can actually affect performance later. So there's definitely different ways to do it, definitely some pros and cons. But it's out there. So that's carb loading. Definitely not for everybody. What should an athlete eat in the hours leading up to competition? So this becomes a little bit more relevant for those of you who exercise or train or compete on a regular basis, right? So the day of a competition or the day of or the day before, let's say you have an evening event. So what should you start eating that night before and the day of? Keep things pretty consistent. Like go for your normal intake of carbohydrates. If you really know, okay, this is going to be a 3-hour race that I'm doing, that's pretty long duration, then the night before, definitely ensure that you're topping off your carbohydrate stores. So have a meal that has, maybe a sweet potato or some good pasta in it, right? So make sure that you're getting enough carbohydrates to top off the amounts that you're going to store, and then throughout the day before the event, keep doing the same. If you're someone who trains every day, then keep your normal sort of intake of carbohydrates going, whether it's 40%, 50%, 60%, whatever you're at, just keep that going up until that 4-hour threshold. Then we'll talk about the strategy once you get there. So once we get up to the exercise, once we get up to the time to exercise, right? So if we're 4 hours out before an event, let's say it's 2 o'clock and you have training at 6 o'clock. What should you do for carbohydrates? Well, smaller meals of carbohydrates, you can eat those all the way up to about an hour, 45 minutes before a training session. And that's a good idea. The closer you get to a training session, the heavier or the greater amount of carbohydrates should be in that food compared to fats and protein. So the closer you get, less fat and protein, more carbohydrates in relative terms. It depends on you. It depends on what you can tolerate for food. So often, I have athletes that are like, yeah, I can't eat anything within 2 hours of training because I get a side ache or whatever it is. So then we modify it from there. But if you can tolerate it, yeah, go for, half of a sandwich, go for a banana with a little bit of peanut butter or something on the side, right? You can have those smaller meals up to an hour before. The idea is the closer it gets to performing and competing, you don't want that food to be in your stomach. You want it to be in your intestines, right? So those nutrients can get into your blood and get to your muscles and do what they need to do for metabolism, which in the case of carbohydrates is provide you with energy. So right up to exercise or the beginning of an event, within 15 minutes, you can consume carbohydrates. That's fine. Be mindful that, again, food will not be digested very well. Once you start exercising, blood flow decreases the GI tract. So liquid, I'd say within 15 minutes is ideal. And that way the liquids will get out of the stomach within that 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Yeah. And it'll get into your bloodstream and you should be able to benefit from those carbohydrates. Again, if you want a time release effect, a little bit of food is okay. If you're doing a 3, 4, 5, 6 hour type of marathon event, ultra event, that's okay to have food. But if you're doing your daily hour and a half soccer practice, you don't need to eat a massive meal before practice. Most likely, that meal is going to be in your stomach after practice. And so all it did was slow you down during training. So there is this danger zone, and I want to talk about it. And it's a zone of time where I very strongly recommend athletes avoid consuming carbohydrates. And it leads this danger zone leads to something called rebound hypoglycemia. And so, again, this graphic is horrible, and I know I need to upgrade it because you can barely read this. But on the y-axis here, it says blood glucose. On the x-axis here, it says time in minutes. This goes from minus 60, minus 40, minus 20, 0, which is the onset of exercise, and then 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. And so what we're looking at is two situations here. Two different groups of individuals or an individual. And so we have a group that consumes something high in glucose about 40 minutes out. And so this danger zone for me, and what I tell my athletes is between 15 and 45 minutes before training, don't mess with any type of carbohydrate consumption. This is why. So if you consume, and in this case, say you did 40 minutes. So you have some sort of glucose feeding 40 minutes before a training session. You have this wonderful spike in blood sugar. Yay, right? Blood sugars, the sugars in the blood, it's going to get delivered to the muscle. Everyone's happy. What accommodates, or what accompanies that spike in blood sugar is going to be that release in insulin. And that insulin that brings that spike in blood sugar down. And this might have been a Gatorade. This could have been a handful of jelly beans, whatever it is, something that has a high glycemic index, cause that spike in blood sugar, you're going to have that spike in insulin with it. And so that insulin, 40 minutes out, has time to do its job, and it will bring blood sugar down and then even lower than it should be. So we'll have a hypoglycemic episode. If we start exercise with low blood sugar, disaster usually follows, right? And if it's just a training session, not a big deal. But here's what happens, and probably a lot of you who are watching this, maybe this has happened to you, not on purpose, of course, it just sort of happened. But you start an exercise session with high blood sugar, your attitude towards training is typically much better. Your rating of perceived exertion for a given exercise intensity is much lower, meaning, yeah, I'm running hard, but it just feels easy, right? Those are the benefits of starting exercise with high blood sugar. If we start with low blood sugar, motivation decreases and rating of perceived exertion for a given exercise intensity is higher, which means, yeah, I was running this speed yesterday and I felt great, and today I just feel like crap, right? The brain senses, it knows it, that you have low blood sugar. The brain doesn't really care whether or not your muscles are full of sugar or not, and whether you have all this extra carbohydrate in your body. It just sees low blood sugar and says, I'm not going to let you exercise as hard as you want because I'm low on sugar, and the brain wants sugar for energy. And so this hypoglycemic rebound or rebound hypoglycemia is a thing, and you need to be really careful to avoid it. And so if you get in a situation where you accidentally have some sort of carb feeding 40 minutes before a session, follow that with another carb feeding, another small one, even just the 3 or 4 swigs of a Gatorade or whatever it is. Try and keep your blood sugar levels high by continuously sort of sipping on a carbohydrate food. That will at least minimize that rebound effect and that low blood sugar. And the only way you're doing it is by adding sugar to your body to prevent the process. So be mindful of that rebound hypoglycemia. It sucks. During competition, this is when we can get away with sugar. This is when actually sugar, I'm not going to say it's great, but man, it can get the job done. And so there's plenty of sport nutrition products out there that try and deliver maximum ratios of carbohydrates and electrolytes and even a little bit of protein to really get you or keep you going at the highest intensity possible, hopefully even maintaining some hydration in the process. And they can be useful. They usually have a fair amount of some sort of glucose or glucose polymer, things like maltodextrin and that kind of stuff. Some have some bigger molecules, some starches in there, right? Because they want a time release effect. There's entire supplement stores full of products to be consumed during competition that will help you perform. Not all of them are only carbohydrates, because these manufacturers recognize that not everyone is only benefiting from carbohydrates, so they'll throw other stuff in them as well. Gels, bars, drinks, they're all good. Be mindful that gels and bars are incredibly low in moisture, low in fluids, and therefore when you consume them while you exercise, absolutely 1000% drink water with them, or you're going to get some massive gastric upset, and that's never a good thing either. So looking at the effects of consuming, So to highlight the effects of why we should consume carbohydrates while we exercise, we have this fancy graph here. This one should be a little bit easier to look at, and so or easier to read. And so on the y-axis here, we have basically glycogen content of the muscles. And basically, we all started at the subjects in this started at full muscle glycogen content, which is a level of 18 grams per kg. And then over time of exercise, and these are various exercise intensities, it just highlights at how quickly the glycogen stores decrease. And so if we start with this highest exercise intensity, that's 30% of VO2 max. This individual went 2 hours. 30% of VO2 max for most of you is going to be like a brisk walk, maybe a light jog, but probably a brisk walk, right? Muscle glycogen barely got tapped into. It's a very aerobic, fat-burning type of intensity. If intensity goes up a little bit at 60% VO2 max, that's a moderate pace. That's a good jog, right? That's a fair jog. We probably got cut through about half of our glycogen stores in 2 hours. Not a big deal. If you're going at 60% VO2 max, you only use up half your glycogen, you're doing pretty good at the end of that exercise session. But check this out. If you go just a little bit harder, 75% of VO2 max, after 90 minutes, you've pretty much used up all your glycogen. 75% of VO2 max for most people is right at their lactate threshold, so that higher intensity training threshold where, yeah, this is a race pace. And so if you go 90 minutes, you're running out of glycogen. These other two intensities are unrealistic to sustain for any time longer than 30 minutes. 90% of VO2 max or 120% of VO2 max, you will go through glycogen very quickly, but other factors are causing fatigue to not allow you to totally tap out, basically. And this is 2 grams per kg glycogen is basically getting to no glycogen whatsoever. Your body will stop at this point. Your body senses, again, your brain knows, hey, muscles are out of glycogen. I'm not going to let you keep exercising. This can be quite dangerous. So the need for replacing glycogen, sugar, while we exercise, think of this as a marker, right? We don't really want it to get down to even 50%, right? So keeping it above, if we're at 18 here, this is probably a 40% decrease here. We don't want to get below that. So when do we need, or how often should we be consuming carbohydrates is that natural question. The best suggestions will follow, right? So if our activity is lasting um, longer than 30 to 60 minutes, and that's at that higher intensity, that 75% of VO2 max, right? So this isn't just a brisk walk or even an easy jog. This is like, oh yeah, we're in the gym doing sprints and other high intensity intervals where it was all high intensity stuff, or I'm going for a trail run that's really hard. If you're going longer than 30 to 60 minutes, really 60 minutes, I would say is a smarter threshold. Going for 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour is helpful. There's no question. The research is out there. It's clear. It's like, yeah, getting carbohydrates in there will help decrease the rate at which you lose muscle glycogen, which means it delays the time where your body says, I'm done, or it delays the onset of fatigue. So research says, yeah, 75 grams per hour is optimal. Yeah, okay, whatever. Life isn't a research lab. But if you can get to that level, all the more power to you. 75 grams is a lot. Some research has even shown that individuals can tolerate up to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour. That's 400 calories of carbohydrates per hour. And for those of you that follow along in some of your other classes, I didn't get into this level in this class that much. 400 calories of metabolism an hour is very doable. If you're exercising hard, if you're at that 75% of VO2 max for an hour, depending on how big you are and how fit you are, we're talking 800 to 1,000 calories an hour burning that. So if you're only consuming 400 calories of carbohydrates in that 100 grams, that isn't that much. So it should be doable. The problem with carbohydrate consumption at that level is more of a gastric issue. Can your stomach handle that much carbohydrates at once, or is it going to be too much? Look at your favorite sports drink and see how many carbohydrates are in a serving. I think a 16-ounce Gatorade has somewhere in the neighborhood of like 25 grams. That's 4 of those Gatorades in an hour. Talk about stomach aches, or maybe even it coming back up the other way. It's just a lot of fluid for some people. It depends. Everybody is different. So bottom line on this, if you're going sessions longer than an hour at a good intensity, consuming carbohydrates, again, 30 to 60 grams is definitely beneficial. Go for it. That puts you soccer players, right? I work with the soccer teams here at St. Mary's. If you're not consuming a carbohydrate drink at halftime, you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because that's 45 minutes of, you better not be just standing there. So 45 minutes of you going hard, your glycogen levels are dropping, right? And if we look at that graph on the previous slide, they might have dropped quite significantly depending on what you're doing in that game. Fill up your tank with carbohydrates if you can. Even if you get breaks during the first half, hey, take a couple swigs of something with sugar in it, right? There's no reason why you shouldn't do that. Don't be a hero. And with soccer and all sports, right? With basketball, I mean, you name any of these sort of mixed sports where, yeah, the end of the game is where games are won and lost, right? And I would hate to be that athlete in the 70th or 80th minute going, if I would have had some carbs at halftime, I'd be running a lot faster right now, right? So think of that application in that way. Here's another graph. Again, apologize for the text on axes. It's not very readable, but we have a couple situations here. This is blood glucose on the y-axis. This is exercise time. This is a group of individuals exercising 65 to 75% of VO2 max, so moderate to moderately high exercise intensity. And this is just measuring blood glucose every 20 minutes. And so this group up at the top here had carbohydrate ingestion every 20 minutes. Look where blood glucose went after 4 hours of exercise, didn't even budge. Awesomeness, right? That means this individual or these individuals had ample carbohydrates available to keep intensity up. These other two groups had no carbohydrate ingestion. Yeah, they made it to the first sort of hour, and hey, blood glucose actually went up. Why did that happen? Because your body starts to liberate it from the liver and dump it in the blood to deliver it to the muscles. Okay. But after about an hour, yeah, the liver says, I'm done. I don't have any left. And blood glucose starts to drop, right? And it drops, and it drops, and it drops, and it drops. And if you don't get any carbohydrate, it will continue to drop and drop and drop. And in this case, these athletes could only go 180 minutes before they're fatigued. They're done. When the body runs out of carbohydrates, it will slow you down or stop you. Some of you have used the term hitting the wall or bonking if you're a cyclist. This is typically a situation where the body's carbohydrate stores are so low that the brain does not allow you to exercise anymore. This third group also did not get any carbohydrates, but at 2 hours, they said, hey, we're gonna give you a little bit of a bonus here. And they said at 2 hours, we're going to start giving you carbohydrates. And so after 2 hours, this group started getting carbohydrate feeding every 20 minutes. I think it was access to something like a All Sport or Gatorade, that kind of thing. Blood sugar started to recover. And so compared to the group that got none, they were actually able to extend exercise another 40 minutes. That's meaningful. And at least the takeaway from this is if you know you're going to go 4 hours, drink carbohydrates from the get-go. There's no benefit to waiting 2 hours in necessarily. So start drinking carbohydrates the whole time. You'll have those carbohydrates available. If you have forgotten to consume carbohydrates and you're 2 hours in, you can still recover, meaning you can still delay the process of fatigue somewhat by getting carbohydrates in. So it's never too late to start. And so in this case, yeah, it helped prolong exercise by 40 minutes compared to not having it. That's a big deal. If you're competing, if you're in a race, if you're in a game trying to outrun or outpace your competitor, carbohydrates in these situations can be really beneficial. So that's the use of carbohydrates for exercise. Again, there's some take-home messages there. Some of you may use them however you like to, but the science is there. They're useful. If you start looking at the different types of carbohydrates in the available sports drinks, they're not all the same necessarily. And so I like this little graphic from my sports science folks. It says, yeah, not all carbs are created equal. When ingested during exercise, some carbohydrates are used fast and some are slow. Depending on who you are, and what's really good is there's nutrition research, product companies coming out now who are really pinpointing, like, yeah, if you're that soccer player, and I'm picking on soccer players today, right? And I know you're going to do 2 45-minute intense sessions, you want faster carbohydrates. But if you're that marathon runner or ultra distance athlete, you don't want fast carbs. You want kind of the time release. And so you'll see mixtures of these different types of carbohydrates in their products to have a different type of effect. For some, you want it immediately. For those people who need the energy now and quickly and don't want it to be some time release thing, yeah, you were looking for things high in glucose, sucrose, maltose, lactose. Yeah, maltodextrin is fantastic, and you'll see that in a lot of sports drinks. Amylopectin, as we mentioned before, you know what amylopectin is. It's a form of starch. We want to see that as opposed to amylose. That's a lot slower. So fructose, galactose, amylose are going to be the ones that slow things down a bit. Have a look. Not all ingredients make it obvious as to what's in it, but the better sports companies will talk about what they put in their products. Right now, there's a company out there called Spring Active, and I'm just getting into some of their products. They use real foods, but they're really trying to pinpoint sources of these different carbohydrates to put in their products, and they're marketing exactly that way. Yeah, if you're going 2 hours or longer, take this one. If you're going in that in between, take this one. If you're going for really quick carbohydrates, take this one. So they're really marketing towards the type of carbohydrate and how quickly you can benefit from them. So another slide from the My Sports Science folks, and this is recommendation chart, carbohydrate intake during exercise. And so if we look here, carbohydrate type, carbohydrate recommendation, and then this is the duration of exercise. So carbohydrate type, less than 60 grams an hour, single or multiple transportable carbohydrates. And so these are basically your faster carbohydrates, right? The recommendation, less than an hour, small amounts, or mouth rinse. And this is something interesting, right? So if you're doing less than an hour, you probably won't run out of carbohydrates if you have a good diet. So you don't really need to supplement carbohydrates if the event lasts an hour or less. If you go beyond an hour, then of course, start carbohydrates early and continue. Interesting research out there in rinsing our mouth with carbohydrates. If we, like a sweet drink, if you put, let's say, Gatorade in your mouth and swish it around, our taste buds tell the brain, yeah, sugar's coming down the pipe and you're going to get some sugar in a minute. So what the brain does is says, awesome, that means I will allow my human to continue exercising at this intensity or even exercise faster because I know that I'm getting some sugar. And so there's research out there on just rinsing your mouth with a sports drink and spitting it out compared to rinsing it with water and spitting it out. Rinsing it with a sports drink, even though it never makes it into your body, shows performance improvements because of the control of the brain on our bodies. So it's pretty fascinating research, really cool stuff. When we get past the 60-minute threshold, 30 grams per hour. This is sort of my soccer player recommendation. If you can get in a full Gatorade the first half-ish, that would be Usually not realistic. Usually not too many breaks in soccer, but if there's a throw-in or injury, don't do water, do Gatorade or something like that. At halftime, do your best to maximize a sports drink. That should hopefully sustain you through most of the second half, right? Basketball players, same type of thing. There's multiple opportunities in things like basketball and lacrosse as well to get drinks in, more so than soccer. As we get past the 2-hour range for a sport, we want to up the amount of carbohydrates that we take in per hour. So that means a little bit more concentrated carbohydrate solution, but 60 grams per hour. This is marathoners, right? Marathoners try and get, as much carbohydrate as possible. 60 grams per hour seems to be pretty good amount. It's a lot. And if you're going longer than 3 hours, and this is ultra distance folks, you're going to be burning through 600, 700, 800, maybe 1,000 calories an hour for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, whatever it is. The more carbohydrates you get in, the better. These are usually situations where I have individuals eat food for the time release factor, even though digestion is really slow. Supplement with some quick carbohydrate drinks, but whatever works for you. So this is a nice chart to sort of refer to depending on you or your clients or whoever you're talking to, your team's situation. This chart, don't worry about this chart much, but this does compare different events with the recommended intake of carbohydrates. So it's kind of the written version of the previous slide. So if we're looking at maximal exercise lasting less than 45 minutes, cycling sprints, most swimming events, most running events, including 10Ks, energy costs are incredibly high. You're going 20 calories a minute for most of these individuals. Oh my gosh. What kind of carbohydrates should you consume? Probably none. It's too short of a duration to need carbohydrates, so skip it, even though you're burning through a lot of them. Max exercise going up to an hour. This is with that kind of gray zone. Do you want to rinse your mouth? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe a couple swigs, maybe a half of a Gatorade, even a full Gatorade if you can tolerate it, would be useful. Once we get longer, right, those recommendations just kind of keep going up. You guys can read this on your own. I'm not going to read it all for you. It does break down the different carbohydrate types. For those of you that are really into like the specifics, I tend to not be so cutthroat on this because I know most carbs ultimately get to where they need to, and sometimes it's only a couple minute difference. But this is a nice chart if you really want to sort of create or design your own sports drink, which is doable. Sometimes expensive, but doable. So anyway, so have a look at this. Okay, so what do we do after exercise? So we've done our exercise session. It obviously depends on our exercise session, how hard it was, how long it was, how depleted we are, right? If it's at 75% of VO2 max for 2 hours and we're completely depleted of carbohydrates, oh my God, replace them, right? But if it was a very light session, you didn't use them up, Generally speaking, the recommendation, and this is sort of one size fits all, which obviously doesn't always work, 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour. So again, convert your body weight to kilograms. If you weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 kgs, which is about 170 pounds, right? That means you should consume about 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrates the first hour after training. One thing that's important to note is that our bodies, and this is going to be true for protein as well, is that when we train, our ability to recover carbohydrates, so recover glycogen essentially, is improved immediately after training. And the ability and the rate, I guess that's a better word to use, the rate at which we recover glycogen decreases the farther away from exercise we get. And so they call this the glycogen window, or some people do. And this glycogen window says that right after exercise, we can take any carbohydrates that we consumed, turn them into glycogen much faster than if we wait 3 or 4 or 5 hours. So the key is, and again, my recommendation to my clients, my athletes is, you should never be walking off the field or the court or out of the gym without drinking your recovery drink. And recovery drinks, in my world, always have some protein and some carbs, but get those carbohydrates and proteins in right away. It starts the recovery process much, much quicker. And most of you, especially in the college world, you're not just training once a week, you're training every day, sometimes twice a day. And the quicker and more thoroughly you can recover, the better you're going to train, and ultimately the better you're going to perform. So anyway, carbohydrates after exercise, we're going textbook, 1 to 1.2 grams per kg per hour. I'm now speaking more towards an exam versus towards the real world. But try and get those carbohydrates in as soon as possible. If we're looking at just recommendations for daily consumption of carbohydrates, those of you who don't do high intensity stuff, so light to moderate endurance training, 5 to 7 grams per kg. Moderate to heavy endurance training, this is definitely, this for me is kind of the basketball, soccer players that I counsel, and some of the lacrosse. Extreme exercise, this is my cross-country runners. Even my lacrosse players dip into this world. Lacrosse is insane. If there's any lacrosse players out there, you guys spend your day just sprinting. There's no jogging in lacrosse, just sprinting. So anyway, those are daily recommendations for carbohydrate, not just post-exercise. So yeah, so I got a little bit ahead of myself with the muscle glycogen synthesis. But I'll at least sort of give you a minute, have a look at this. Muscle glycogen is synthesized slowly. Recovering it is a process. The rate differs depending on the prior exercise conditions. The harder you exercise, the quicker we can synthesize glycogen. So after low intensity, we get to about 7 to 9 millimoles per kg per hour. Again, kind of arbitrary units for this class, but after high intensity exercise, which is, again, the difference between low intensity and high intensity exercise uses carbohydrates as a primary energy source. The body, because you just burn through carbs at a high rate, wants to replace them at a high rate. And so you can kind of think of it in those terms. If I'm using carbs quickly, my body's going to make them quickly. So low intensity exercise, that's a light jog or walk around the park kind of thing. High intensity, we're talking intervals, we're talking long efforts of high intensity. It will replace it probably twice as fast or recover it twice as fast. So to optimize it, exercise-induced muscle damage will prevent glycogen synthesis in those muscle fibers. So you hurt a muscle or you damage a muscle through training, right? If your muscles are sore, they've been damaged, which means your muscles can store less glycogen if you're sore. So soreness is a sign of injury or damage. It's sometimes a necessary or it feels like a necessary part of the process of adapting to training, but you want to avoid going into an event sore. It just doesn't lead to good things. Reduce strength, reduce carb storing. Passive recovery is better than active recovery. So when you're done training, if you can, don't do anything, right? If you're using your muscles, if you're still walking around, those muscles are being used and the body will not convert glucose to glycogen if those muscles are being used. We need to consume that 1 to 1.2 grams per kg. That maximizes the recovery or the synthesis rate. Ingestion is as soon as possible after exercise, and it should be primarily a glucose-containing carbohydrate drink, which isn't a problem because most of them are. So here's a graph of research done to identify the best synthesis rate in relationship to carbohydrate intake. And so on the y-axis here, this is muscle glycogen resynthesis in millimoles per kilogram, and then we have carbohydrate intake in grams per minute. And so yeah, you'll notice that if you're not consuming very much, less than half a gram of carbohydrate intake per minute, synthesis isn't that good. The relationship is somewhat linear, meaning that the more you consume, the faster the glycogen synthesis rate is. But at least what this article or what this research is highlighting, this graph, is that, there's kind of this group right here that seems to be the best bang for the buck. You consume, up to 2 or even 2.5 grams per kg. Synthesis may or may not be much better. But it really seems like this 1 to 1.2 range is the optimum range of carbohydrates to consume to maximize glycogen synthesis. So aim for that. Do your math. Enjoy the view. That's it on carbohydrates. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I'll see you next time for proteins.